This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
One of the most enduring stories in the Old Testament is the story of how Moses went from nearly being killed as a boy to rising up to become one of the most powerful men in all of Egypt, to discovering his whole life was a lie, running away to escape a murder charge, returning and freeing his people from the evil Pharaoh. Now, we've all seen the story with Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner. It wasn't quite that way. And we're going to talk about that with our guest today. He is a professional writer and filmmaker, an award-winning screenwriter. His first feature film, To End All Wars, featured Kiefer Sutherland and Robert Carlyle, but he's got several series of fiction that incorporate the divine council worldview into epic storytelling. Chronicles of the Nephilim, Chronicles of the Watchers, Chronicles of the Apocalypse. His brand new novel, Moses Against the Gods of Egypt. This is in the Chronicles of the Watchers, book 3 of that series. And it's accompanied by, as he's been doing with his last several novels, a companion book that goes into the research, the theology, the history, the archaeology behind the story, the companion book, The Spiritual World of Moses in Egypt, Biblical Background to the Novel Moses. We welcome back to the program for the first time in far too long, Brian Godawa. Brian, hey, Merry Christmas to you and Kimberly.
Likewise. And now that I'm in Texas, y'all.
That's right.
I moved the heck out of L.A. last year, and we moved to Texas.
So we can call you
that's
Snake.
one of the reasons why it's been a long time.
Yeah. Well, wise move, given the things that have gone on over the last year and a half. I don't want to rabbit trail too long, but I mean, there are certain parts of the country that are relatively unaffected right now by COVID-19. The Ozarks is one. I know Texas is another. In fact, you're in the Dallas metro. Am I right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll be there in March. I'll tell you about that in a little later.
Great. We'll meet up.
Yeah. So the novel Moses Against the Gods of Egypt, a retelling of the story that we read in the Bible, but you incorporate the things happening in the unseen realm. What's the plot, and how is this maybe different from other tellings of the Moses story?
Yeah, well, first of all, I got to thank you for having me on, because you've had me on for just about every one of my novels, and all those years ago, I remember when we started, and so I appreciate it so much. I wish I could have given you the first interview, but, people just got in line before you, and what can I say, But I did contact you,
at
the first, so. But yeah, so this novel, Moses, is, like you said, it's in the same vein of the Chronicles of the Nephilim, although it's part of the Chronicles of the Watchers series. And to understand that, basically I wrote these 8 novels of Chronicles of the Nephilim, and I hit, I wanted to retell Bible stories where there were giants in them and watchers, but mostly I was focusing on giants, see? And so when I went through it, and, I ended up having Joshua, a story about Joshua Valiant, Caleb Vigilant. Those are the names of the novels. And I skipped the Moses story because there wasn't any giants in it on the surface level, right? And so, but now that I'm doing Chronicles of the Watchers, I'm kind of going back and sort of doing books that can fit in the holes of Chronicles of the Nephilim, right? And also, I realized that in a way, I believe there is watcher reference in the story of Moses. But like I said, because I was focusing on giants, I think that's probably why I sort of neglected it first. But lo and behold, it fits right in there now, and it flows right with my other novels. So I'm really excited about that, even though it's a standalone novel. And the whole thing sort of, I guess, in some ways, the whole journey of me realizing, hey, there's a Watcher novel here that I shouldn't have jumped over. It was Exodus 12:12, where Yahweh says, I will execute judgment upon all the gods of Egypt.
Right.
And it's like, what? Right. And so that sort of got me going, yeah, of course. And I'm thinking, the plagues, what are the plagues? And of course, I think most people, have the basic belief that the judgments of the plagues are upon the gods. It's upon Pharaoh, but it's upon the gods of Egypt. But there's different theories about what that was. And as I looked into it, I found, I wanted to say, well, how can so the premise of the series is, first of all, I'm retelling the Bible story of Moses, and I'm trying to do, historical research and such. But I also want to tell the story of what's happening in the spiritual heavenlies. So, in our divine council understanding, or what I call the Watcher paradigm, the notion that, of course, there are, principalities and powers over nations or peoples or sometimes cities, right? So there are these spiritual powers over them, and they're linked in some way. And so what would that look like? In other words, if I pulled back that curtain and showed the spiritual world, well, I had to speculate, of course. But so I wanted to address that issue, but then I thought, but in what way were these plagues judgments? Because on a surface level, you might conclude, well, there's plague of frogs. So is there a frog god? Well, yeah, there's one called Hecate. Is there a locust god? Yeah, Senahem. Ra's the sun god. So, maybe the darkness might fit with that. Mm-hmm. But in truth, in the end, there's not all the plagues, line up one-on-one with actual deities. Right. Like such as flies or pests and stuff. So it's kind of like only half there, and I as I looked more into it, I really discovered a fascinating concept of what's going on. I still believe it's God's judging the gods, but the other element that I wanted to say was most of those individual gods, like the Hecate of the frog god and the locust god, they're very minor deities. Right. So you've got the major deities of Egypt, Isis, Osiris, and Horus, and they're not really addressed. And that doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would God judge these minor deities that don't really have anything to do with the power of Egypt, right? Well, when you study the Egyptian system of gods and goddesses, which, there's hundreds of them, literally, what you come up with is there aren't specific gods of singular things. The gods have different responsibilities, and so a lot of them overlap. If you see a picture of the Egyptian cosmology, it's really kind of funny looking. There's Nun, the primeval waters, then the goddess Nut, that's sort of the sky. Mm-hmm. She's actually a goddess, right? And then there's Shu, the god of the air, and then Ra on his solar boat. So it's this really cool. If you like fantasy, but it's also bizarre from our perspective, right? Well, here's what I think I discovered, and I literally did a list of this in my research book. There's not a god of the Nile. There are many gods. In fact, I found about 20 different deities connected to the Nile. Now, the first notion people might think is Hapi, the god of the Nile, right? But actually, he's not just the god of the Nile. He's the god of the inundation of the Nile. Okay. There's a guardian god of the Nile named Khnum. Mm-hmm. There's a crocodile god, which is Sobek, which is a very key deity as well, right? And I can go on and on. So there's like 20 of them. And the same thing goes with things like livestock. There's no specific god of livestock, but there are multiple deities that interact. God of crops and fertility. There's multiple gods of fertility and crops, right? So what I came up with was this whole chart and, listing about 10 to 20 gods for each of these various plagues. And so the point of it is that the Egyptian system is not a one-to-one correspondence of deities. It is a systemic pantheon. So, which kind of makes the judgments more glorious, in my opinion, because God is not just like judging these specific things. What he's doing is what theologians call decreation. He's actually returning the cosmos of Egypt back to chaos to mock and judge those Egyptian deities. In the Egyptian worldview, they believe that the deities were the gods of creation. They sustained it, and they brought the life-giving waters and the growth. And it was one system. They're all interactive, working together in one whole, right? And it's sort of like an interwoven, integrated system. And so God was simply returning each of these various elements back to chaos, or using chaos elements like the pests, swarms of pests, which are understood as chaotic elements, right? And so floods are chaotic. So he's judging the whole system, and it's like he's saying, your gods have no power over any of these things that you claim. They're completely worthless. I am reverting it all to chaos because I am the God of all creation. And then, of course, the theological notion there is that he's reducing Egypt to chaos, and then he brings his people out through the seas, which is another common motif of creation, actually, in all these ancient Near Eastern stories. And then he creates, in Sinai, with the covenant, he is creating the heavens and earth, so to speak, the cosmos of Israel, he's creating his order out of the chaos of Egypt. And this is why if you read Psalm 74, he's describing very poetically the crossing of the Red Sea. But look closely there. Let me go ahead and read a couple of these things because I think it's kind of interesting.
Psalm 74 is fascinating, beginning at verse 12.
Yeah. So my God is from my King. God, my King is from of old. You divided the sea by your might. Mm-hmm. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads, plural, of Leviathan. We've talked about this. I know you have extensively on your program. So Leviathan is that chaos creature in the Bible. So he's connected to the seas. The seas are chaos, but he's also parting this chaos as part of also leaving Egypt. He says, you gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. So the banquet of feasting on the chaos monsters is a very common theme as well. You split open the spring brooks, and then get all of this. He says, yours is the day, yours is the night. You've established the heavenly lights and the sun. You have fixed all the boundaries of the earth. You may have made summer and winter. This is creation language. Mm-hmm. And so he's using creation language to describe, in a sense, he reverted that Egyptian world to chaos, and now he's creating a new cosmos, the cosmos for Israel, right? And so that's the beauty of the poetic language that's going on there. And I wanted to bring some of that poetry too into the novel as well. But that's sort of the concept of the judgment on the gods. And so the way I depicted that was, I won't spill the beans because I can't. Here's the thing: you've got 10 plagues, right? And even the Charlton Heston movie, it's like they don't show all the plagues. They only show a few, and then they sort of like skip over the others. Because if you were to go through each and every plague, it could be kind of dramatically not as interesting, right? So I thought, how can I wanted to hit all those plagues and describe them and go through them. So I told the spiritual story of what's going on and how are these spiritual watchers, how are they being judged in relation to the plagues? And that's sort of my unique imagination that I'm helping, bring to the mix to sort of make some sense of the theology of what's going on, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons that your fiction and my wife's fiction, Sharon's, in her Red Wing saga, my favorite fiction to read when I have time to read fiction right now, because she does the same thing, just set in Victorian England, not back in the ancient Near East. And this to me is intriguing, even for another aspect that you got into early in the novel, and I'm still working my way through it. Difficult to find time to read anything that's not directly related to other stuff I'm working on. But the gods of Egypt have a confrontation with the gods of Nubia, the gods of Cush.
Kush.
And this is something that I don't think most of us really consider. Why do we assume that all of these fallen watchers would be aligned or allied with each other against God? Yeah. If they think that they've got a chance of knocking Yahweh off his throne, why wouldn't they be competing to see who would be the next to establish their own mount of assembly? So
yeah,
how did that influence your research in the writing of this story? Yeah. The idea that maybe you had competing camps on the enemy side.
Yeah. Well, think about it. I mean, most movies we have and stuff tend to, and even in my own mindset, I had always thought of, Satan and his minions, or however you see it. They're this one unified army of evil, and it's like, and as I was studying this stuff materially, I was realizing, that doesn't sound like reality. Like, evil people don't operate that way. Evil people are jockeying for their own power. They want to be powerful over others, right? And it's more like mafia, where, they work together, but they're killing each other or jockeying for power. And is this just something that I'm bringing to the text, or is it in the text? Well, I would argue it actually is. So if you look at, of course, Psalm 82 talks about that scenario about these, the different gods are over these territories. They're supposed to rule over them. But remember, Daniel, what is it? Is it 9 where he talks about the Prince of Persia?
I believe that's correct. I'll look up while you continue.
That 4 is the Watchers, and I think Daniel 9 is the Prince of Persia, right? Or am I off? No, it's 10. It's 10. 10. I got to remember that.
Daniel 10:10.
So, this is where there's a biblical basis to it, because he talks about how, Gabriel's saying, I'm going to return to fight against the prince of Persia, and behold, the prince of Greece will come. And of course, that's in the context of the Danielic prophecies where Greece overtakes Persia, and those are earthly kingdoms. And think about it, the whole principle is, if there's a war on earth, there's a war in heaven. Well, this is the passage that sort of reinforces it, that the spiritual principality of Persia is actually, and the spiritual principality of Greece, they're at odds with one another. And so that's sort of the support of this notion that, like you said, like a mafia or something like that, they can all be on the same team, but also be wanting to have power over each other, and especially when they're in competition with other nations. And so I also I bring in a little bit of the Canaanite situation, because at that time Canaanite was subject to Egypt. So they're those deities are also subject, but there will be a time in the near future where that will shift around, right? As the different nations on earth rise in power and fall in power.
And realign.
So I try to reflect that national power in the spiritual realm as well. And that's what makes it more interesting than just these cardboard villains. We're all just in this together. We're all unified.
Yeah. Where's your Messiah now? Which, just for the record, I know that was not Edward G. Robinson. That was Billy Crystal doing Edward G. Robinson. That was not actually in the movie. But we even see hints of this in Scripture. This is something that jumped out at us the last time we went through the book of Daniel, right after that section of Daniel 10, where Gabriel is describing how the prince of Persia was withstood him for 21 days, and Michael had to come help him. Daniel 11:1, Gabriel still speaking, and as for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. Like, wait, what? So,
excellent. Yeah, that's an excellent point.
As Daniel writes elsewhere in his book, God is the one who lifts up kings and ones who destroys them as well. So he raises them up and tears them down.
Absolutely.
So what we see in our daily news headlines, just sort of the shadows of what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah. So that was my motivation for that sort of watcher motif. And so if you pull back and see the big picture, what you have is Yahweh at war with Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt. And so, and historically speaking, when Pharaoh's army is wiped out, well, not just Pharaoh's army, but think about it, when all the land of Egypt is wiped out, virtually, like famine, almost all the crops, this is really deadly. And so many of the people, it's like they were completely vulnerable, right? And I'll explain a little bit my view of what happens after that related to the Hyksos, which I know is a little bit different than what you've had on your show in other with other guests. But that was the next thing I want to talk about, is the difficulty of doing the Moses story. This has been the most difficult of all of my stories, I think, because anyone who studies the Bible knows that there are controversial or debated issues throughout the text. Whether historical connections. I don't mean historicity. I mean historical connections. Who's who? What's real? But also theological ones, like where there's just one verse that says something like Miriam and Aaron were mad because Moses was married a Cushite wife. Mm-hmm. What? Where'd that come from, right? So there's a lot of these things that, as I wanted to retell the story, I'm like, well, I got to figure out what some of these things are, because they're very relevant. So I did do all these studies, and when I did, I was overwhelmed, because there's reasons why they're still debated, because there are good arguments on both sides of issues. So, but nevertheless, one of the issues is, who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, right? And where is the Red Sea? Is it Reed Sea, Red Sea, or is it something else? Which I really want to talk to you about.
Okay.
But so I had to deal with these. So that's why it took me over a year to get this novel out, as well as the fact that I moved. So I journeyed into these things, and because when you're writing. If you're writing a theological book, you can sort of say, well, here's both sides. I tend towards this side. This has better arguments or whatever. But when you're writing a novel, you have to commit. So I did the best I could, and I explored what I thought were the answers to this. But in my journey to find out what tack am I going to take, I stumbled upon, well, I actually knew about this series, and I know you know about it, Patterns of Evidence, which is a documentary series by Tim Mahoney.
Right.
It's got 4 documentaries now, but the first one was called, The Exodus. And that was, I think, the medium that opened my mind to the particular approach that I ended up going with. I pretty much follow most of what he argues in his 4 documentaries so far, and growing, right?
Right.
And in those documentaries, he featured one of his featured scholars is David Rohl.
Yes.
He's a controversial Egyptologist who is actually not a believer, but he fights to support the basic historicity of the Bible. So he argues more on behalf of the Bible than some Christians do.
Yeah.
And part of that journey, there's two aspects to it. One was the arguments for the late date versus the early date of the Exodus. And I come down on the early date, the 1446, and that's actually the traditional view.
Right.
So, but then there's a little bit of a departure because while there are a lot of evangelicals who obviously support that, David Rohl has, if you know anything about Egyptian history, it's a mess.
Yes.
It is a mess. And there is a consensus chronology, but we're talking several thousand years, 400 pharaohs, and it's, the evidence, there's a lot of holes. So there is a conventional chronology or consensus, and David Rohl, though, brings up an argument with what he calls the new chronology. I'm not going to go into it because it's above my pay grade as it is. It's
very
really
convoluted,
but it's really hard to hold on to. But,
right.
But he makes an argument that, and he's an Egyptologist. He's no fly-by-night guy, and he basically makes an argument that most of the Egyptian chronology is off. There's a lot of overlapping things that people don't catch. There's a lot of misinterpretations and such. And he argues that there's a big shift in the Egyptian chronology of when things actually occur. And so not in terms of the dynasties, so the normal consensus might argue that, the second, the third, there's several periods of Egyptian history.
Right.
And he argues that they're sort of misplaced. Okay. So without getting into all those details, he makes the argument, which is kind of fascinating because he draws from archaeoastronomy. So he connects things like eclipses and star alignments that are referenced in some ancient documents. And now we can be pretty precise on that. He also addresses there's only a few in terms of biblical chronology and matching it up with Egyptian chronology. There's only like a handful of things that people are relatively certain of, and those he brings into question. So at the end of the day, what he concludes is that the Exodus does occur in 1447 BC or so, around thereabouts. But the pharaoh of that time period was not Amenhotep or Thutmose or whatever. That it was the pharaoh of the end of the 13th dynasty, which is actually Dudimos. Dudimos is his argument, which is he's a minor pharaoh, but I found his arguments interesting because it's not just arbitrary. He has there are actual evidences of some archaeological evidences that point in a very interesting direction, as well as some ancient historians, which I can touch upon some. But there's a lot of it in agreement with what you've already had on your show, Doug Petrovich, when he talks about Joseph and stuff like that. There's a lot of that's overlapping, I believe, but there's a difference there with the Exodus. But here's what's cool, though. He also like I said, there's a lot of mystery and a lot of moving around of dates with all throughout Egyptian chronology. The Hyksos, which is a very much of a mysterious lot that there are various scholarly opinions on and when they occurred. Well, he makes an argument that in his new chronology, the Hyksos aren't way before the Jews. They're actually the ones who invade Egypt after the Jews leave, when Egypt's wiped out. That's why they're able to take it over without a fight.
Right.
And the Hyksos bring in the Canaanite god Baal into the Goshen, and that's when all that stuff sort of grows up from there. And then he, okay, that's just a few pieces of the historical thing. So I try to incorporate those into the story. But the truth is, I'm trying to be consistent with the Bible. So it doesn't matter what view you have of what Pharaoh. You could literally substitute your own Pharaoh's name in there, because I'm trying to stay true to the Bible. So, at the end of the day, it's okay, whatever, you'll still enjoy it no matter what Pharaoh you believe was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Let's put it that way, right? Yeah. But it is a fascinating journey to explore, as I know you know. But it's a fun one. But I recommend that. I think probably a lot of people can't handle the scholarly work like you can, Mr. Scholar yourself.
Yeah, right.
You can call yourself a layman, but you're on the level of a scholar, man. I'm telling you.
Yeah, you're very kind.
But I just recommend the Patterns of Evidence documentary, because
I agree.
It takes a lot of intelligent material and makes it understandable, but it's not dumbed down. I've watched it all videos 3 times, and I still get something out of it every time.
No, and so very, very well done.
A little bit of the the brainiac stuff behind the story. So, but there were some fascinating things that, as I was exploring some of these, trying to find answers, and I think probably one of the most interesting things was Moses himself. Now, there's a few things that, I knew of, and maybe your listeners know about these too, but when you really go into it and explore it and you consider, how does this affect the story? One of them is that Moses actually had a stuttering problem. Mm-hmm. And many people do know about this, but it's not just an interpretation. Like the words that are used where he talks about uncircumcised of lips and such, I go through a study of this stuff, and it actually it is the language that's used of stuttering elsewhere in the Bible.
Oh, okay.
And so he did. He did. He had a stuttering problem. So my Moses does not, as much as Charlton Heston is my favorite actor when I was a kid, and that was my favorite, one of my favorite characters. Yes, the biblical Moses, in my opinion, is not strong of speech like Charlton Heston was. So I have an actual stuttering Moses, and I do think God deals with it in some miraculous way at some point. But he had that. I also think he had an anger problem. If you read between the lines, and some not between the lines, just explicitly, you see a lot of his reactions have a lot of, throughout the Exodus story, I think it displays anger. Mm-hmm. He was married to a Cushite wife, so that's one verse in the Bible, and it comes up at a point where Miriam and Aaron are questioning Moses' authority. Like, we can speak for God too, right? And they're like, well, you're married to that Cushite wife. And it's like, what's that about? Is that racism? Because Cush was in Ethiopia,
right?
And she was a black woman. But I just thought, that was a fascinating idea. He marries this black woman, but the problem is the Bible doesn't mention her anywhere. Now, it does mention he's married to Zipporah, but mm-hmm. she's a Midianite, and they're not black.
Right. And
so the question is, now, there are some arguments that maybe she was, and there's some good arguments for that, because you could be, Jethro could be a Midianite. He's a trader. He's, he could have married a Cushite woman, right, and had they had multiple wives, right? Mm-hmm. So it's entirely possible, but it's not in the text, right? And then the other element was, though, that I found some ancient legends in Josephus and in Artapanus, which is another ancient Jewish historian, that tell stories not in the Bible, but it jives with the Bible. And that was, they describe Moses as a general in Pharaoh's army, and during you mentioned it earlier that Egypt had a history of competition with Cush. Sometimes they were okay, sometimes they warred, and then at this time period they actually conquered him, because it tells the story of Moses. Actually, there's 2 stories. One is Moses on the way to battling Cush. He takes his army through this area where there are flying snakes, right?
Oh, yeah.
The same kind as in numbers, right?
Right.
And it's like it's in Egyptian territory. And what he does is he comes up with this. He's clever, and he's kind of like Thoth, the Egyptian god of cleverness and intelligence and he's the scribal god, right? So what he does is he brings these ibis birds, baskets of ibises, and ibises were snake killers. So he released the birds, and they go out and they hunt down these ibises, and so that his army, because if his army went through this valley or this area, they would be attacked, right? So he does that to get rid of them on his way to Cush. That was kind of cool, so I incorporated that into the story. But then when he conquers the capital of Cush, that's when, as a form of treaty, the princess of Cush, of that city, marries Moses in this ancient legendary story. And some people say, well, those were ancient Jews who made up the story in order to argue it makes sense of the Cushite verse, right? But nevertheless, what I do is I'm trying to draw from other ancient sources for my imagination, because I think there's so much fascinating stuff in ancient non-biblical literature as well, Second Temple literature, ancient Egyptian literature, and I try to incorporate it all in a way that jives with the Bible as well. And so that was those were some interesting elements, as well as the Janus and Jambres story. We know about Janus and Jambres only because Paul talks about in 2 Timothy, right? The magicians who confronted Moses were Janus and Jambres. Who are they? Well, they're not mentioned in the Old Testament, but there's a book, pseudepigrapha, called Janus and Jambres, and there's a really interesting story about how one of them dies actually and tries to and realizes they were wrong to fight against Moses, and tries to tell his brother, repent, don't stand against Moses, and he doesn't. So that I found so fascinating that I incorporated a version of that into my story as well. So one of my main characters in the story that I bounce back and forth with is Janus and Jambres, the brothers, the magicians, and Moses, and then some other characters. Now it's interesting because the magicians, the word that we have for magicians, I think it's a bad English translation, because we think of, men who do, sleight of hand and all that kind of stuff, or maybe we might believe that, they also can have access to the occult and have some occultic powers. Sure. But it's just a word that I think has too much modern baggage. They were actually called lector priests in Egypt. That's what they were actually called. So I call them that because they were priests of the temples, like the Temple of Ra, etc. And so in Egypt, that's what they were understood to be. And part of their responsibility as lector priests was to do the magical elements. But magic in Egypt is a very integrated part of their worldview. They believe that the reason why you read a lot of spells, it's not like I'm going to cast a spell. They believe that the reciting of the words of spells brought them power, whether it's power to get a deity to do what they want or power to protect themselves. So you have the Egyptian Book of the Dead,
right?
And what it is these spells that are given for you when you're on your journey in the underworld, which the Egyptians called duat. When you're in the underworld and you're facing these various obstacles in your journey, you have to know these spells, and that's what helps you get past them, right? And so they believed that there was power in language, and it was like if you can connect to the formulas, you could achieve these great things. So it was an integrated view of reality. It's not like they believed in magic and they didn't believe in science. They actually had science and magic, and they understood there was a difference between the two. They believed there was epilepsy and things could be cured with natural sources, but that sometimes, oh no, this is not a natural problem. This is more of a spiritual problem. So they had a very integrated view in that sense. And that's one of my ramblings of just the sort of the kind of things that I'm addressing in the story that I don't think we've seen before. And yet when you're reading this stuff, like I have a journey through the Egyptian underworld. I explain it, you'll understand later, but and that was my way of showing what their understanding of the world is. It's a vision, right? And which is it's not quite the same as Sheol in Judaism, but there's some similarities. But one interesting thing I found was that the notion of the lake of fire is not in any other religion but Egypt. Egypt had a lake of fire in their underworld. And so that's why there are some scholarly arguments that the Lake of Fire in Revelation has some Egyptian connection in some way. In what way, that's to be debated, but these are sort of some of these cool things that you find, you discover when you explore the depths of the religion and such. And the problem is it's a mess because there's all kinds of contradictions. There are gods that become other gods. They change their names. They combine their names. Right. And a lot of it's historical. At one point, Ra is the sun god, is the king of the gods. And then at one point, he melds with Amun and becomes Amun-Ra. And that's connected. Interestingly, that's connected to historically what's going on as the South unites with the North, because Egypt had a history of North and South battling, becoming one, becoming separated, right? So these spiritual things do reflect the historical realities as well. But my point is, though, it's such a mess because there's all kinds of contradictions and a lot of stuff. They just make things up. But it's because I think that the Egyptian worldview is about it's about understanding reality through their mythical symbolism. So it doesn't have to be scientifically consistent for them to make sense. They don't. If you look at the picture of the cosmos with, like I said, with Nut over the sky, that's not. That's their way of depicting it. That's not like that's how they think it actually is, So it's a fascinating but confusing religion. But here's the thing: it was the context and the background out of which Moses was raised, like you said. And one of the debated issues is, what did Moses know and when did he know it? Because we only have one paragraph of his birth, one paragraph of him at 40. And then a few paragraphs at 80. And then the story starts with the Exodus, right?
Right.
So and some of that's mysterious. And the bottom line is it's not really clear when he really knew who he was. Now, by the time he murders that Egyptian, he does know that those are his people to some degree, but it doesn't say how much, right? So I took the tack that he literally didn't know until he's 40. And what that means is he's very, very Egyptian. And so I wanted to tell this story, like, what would it be from that perspective where it's so Egyptianized? And even though he interacts with the Jewish slaves and he learns about them because his nurse, wet nurse, and his maids, some of them happen to know about Judaism, right? And so he learns a little bit about it, but ultimately it's a big shocker for him. And so he's very, very Egyptian is my point. So I tried to, what would he be like thinking as an Egyptian? And that's the other thing too, is like, he doesn't like, okay, if you think that he did come to know about Yahweh or about his Hebrew background, he doesn't know anything about Yahweh until the burning bush. What's your name, right? Who shall I call? Who shall I say? And it's like, wow. And that's when he's 80 years old. So there's some interesting, mysterious things going on here. And but I had some fun with him because I took the tack that he was, like I say, he's very Egyptian. But then when he goes to Midian, that's another interesting part of the story, I think, because he's there for 40 years and we don't, he marries Zipporah and he gets to know Jethro, and Jethro's a very cool guy. But I think he's a priest of Baal. Some people think he was a Yahwist priest, but I think the evidence shows he was a priest of Baal.
That would be more likely.
This is another debated. What?
I said that would be more likely, I think.
Yeah. But there is debate on both sides that he may have been a Yahwist or whatever, but so I think he was a priest of Baal, and but yet he was a good guy, And this is, can pagans be good people? Yeah, in a relative sense, of course they can. But here's the interesting thing. So one of the themes that I wrestle with throughout the story is the fatherhood. Here you have a man, Moses, right, who his father, he doesn't abandon him because they're trying to save him, but nonetheless, he doesn't protect him. They give him over into the hands of Egyptians, but he's not really mentioned. He's never really mentioned. Amram, and he lived to be 137 years old. Amram ended up going in the Exodus, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But he's never mentioned.
Huh.
And it's kind of interesting because by the time Moses realizes who he is, you'd think that there would be something connected there. Anyway, he gets adopted by a pharaoh who isn't his father, and then, of course, ends up trying to kill him. Then he goes to Midian, and that's 40 years, right? Then he goes to Midian for 40 years, and he meets a Midianite nomad, priest of Baal, who becomes a father figure for him. And so he learned, but he also learns how to be a shepherd. And it's so heartwarming to understand how God was preparing him to be the leader of the nation. He can't just be a general of an army that knows how to lead people and such. He needs to be a shepherd who loves his people as well. So he learns how to become a shepherd for 40 years. So I try to tell a little bit of that story. There's not much. So I fictionalize how I think it might have been. A little bit of that story of him learning to become a shepherd to learn the father heart of God in a way. And then he goes back and there's still no mention of his father. And you would think, there would be some kind of reconciliation. I think maybe his father was just immensely ashamed of not having been able to be the father he should have been. And so Moses is a man that has father issues, right?
Sure.
And I mean, that's a modern way of putting it, but think about it, never really having a father. And I think it's about him learning the fatherhood of God, which I can relate to, where sometimes your earthly fathers don't rise up to be what they should be for you, but God, the Father, can be that father for you, So that's a personal theme that I wanted to wrestle with in the story as well. So, you've got the action, you've got romance because he falls in love with Zipporah, marries her, and he actually falls in love with a Cushite princess as well. And I won't tell you what happens there, but so there's the personal element as well, and then the supernatural element, and then also the theological element where I wanted to make some sense of this idea of Moses writing the Pentateuch, which I believe this is another debated issue. Did he write it or was it written after the Babylonian exile? I don't believe it was written after Babylonian exile, but I'm in the camp where it's like he wrote the basic foundation of it, but there was editorial process over time and stuff was added, et cetera, as needed. For example, there's a lot of proven factoids that could only come after the fact, after Moses. But anyway, but still, I believe he wrote the basic foundation. And think about that. If he did write at least the beginning, most of Genesis 1 and such, he had an understanding of Babylonian culture because there's Babylonian influence on there. There's Egyptian influence. In fact, I believe it had the most influence on Genesis 1 and 2 is Egyptian, far more than Babylonian notions. But I wanted to make sense of this. Is this something that editors bring in after the fact? I actually don't think so, because if he was raised as royalty, and think about it, Egypt loved literature, and they were a world power, and they traded with all these nations. And they're after, like, for example, after the time of Hammurabi, right? So, and some of these Assyrian kings, so they would have a lot of the literature that people say had influence on the Bible later. I think Moses had access to that literature as a royal Egyptian in his time period. That doesn't mean he absolutely wrote absolutely everything. There's obviously editorial things in there, but that was a fascinating thing. So I make him kind of a nerd. He's kind of a Renaissance man. He loves scribes. He loves hiding out at the libraries and reading all these texts and stuff. So I try to make him a very human person as well, because he's got this stuttering problem. He's got an anger problem. He's struggling with his father. He's not the Charlton Heston that we know of, but in a very real sense, I think the biblical Moses is far more human and connectable to us than we think in a shallow level. If that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely, it does. You can see his flaws, his anger issues when he strikes the rock twice, when he to bring forth water against God's specific command. Even
some of the words that when he's talking to Yahweh, if you read between the lines, it's like God just told you 3 times and you're still saying, yeah, but. Like there's there's a doubt problem going on there that's inappropriate,
Sure. And the correction or the advice given to him by Jethro is, look, the way you're managing the people is not good. You're going to burn yourself out. So here, do this instead. So yeah, he's not as perfect as some may assume. And I think that argues for the authenticity of the Bible, because you would assume that if you wanted to really make the case to sell this new religion, editors later on would have cleaned up some of those things, and some of those things with some of the other patriarchs and the apostles as well, that show their humanity. The root of the Exodus. Let me back up just a second. You depict Moses as a general, and you. And I want to get into the name that you chose, the Sobek Moza, as the Egyptian name by which he was known. But as a general, leading people away from Egypt, he would have an understanding of what the capabilities of the Egyptian cavalry, the Egyptian chariot corps had. And so it must have come as quite a shock to him when in Exodus 14, God says to him, "Oh, turn around and go back over here to this place." Pi-Haroth, I know I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but opposite Baal Zephon, clues that point to, I think, not just geographic location, but also a spiritual message. But at least in terms of the geography, how did that inform your choice of where you in the story place the Red Sea crossing?
Yeah, so this is one that I wanted to recommend to you if you haven't already read it. Have you read Glenn Fritz's book, The Lost Sea of Exodus?
I haven't. I saw your reference to it in your companion book, The Spiritual World of Moses in Egypt. So I'm going to flag it to read.
Buy it. Trust me, you'll love it. It's fascinating. I'm not saying you'll have to agree with it, but it changed my mind on a lot of things, but it also explained a lot of things that didn't make sense. So the author, Glenn Fritz, he's actually featured in the Patterns of Evidence documentary. That's how I found out about him too. And I got his book, and you can only get him on. You can't even get it on Amazon. You can only get it on his website, and it's kind of expensive. But to me, it was for guys like you and me who love doing the research stuff. It's totally worth it. And you can get the digital version for cheaper. And of course, that's the best because you can search.
Right.
Anyway, he goes through an explanation of the argument for the Red Sea crossing being at the Gulf of Aqaba. And we know that now we know that the Red Sea has two gulfs: Gulf of Suez, which is the traditional understanding of Red Sea, and the Gulf of Aqaba. And we know that there's three main theories. I believe that the traditional Red Sea crossing at the traditional Red Sea, Gulf of Suez, and then the Bitter Lakes or the northern lakes where it's there's that view, and that's the most common view now, even with some Christians. And I'm not against it because the Patterns of Evidence movie does a good, honest approach to showing all the views. It has a particular bias, but it doesn't trick you. It shows the best arguments for all these views, and then the Gulf of Aqaba. And there's some fascinating things I learned that in the process of it. So Glenn Fritz is actually he's got a PhD in some kind of geological background and stuff. So his approach is studying a lot. He wanted to make sense of the route of the Exodus, location of Sinai and Yam Suf, Red Sea, where, based on the geographical factors that also he studied of those areas and stuff. And his conclusion was that the traditional view of where they cross the Gulf of Suez, and then they go down south on the Sinai Peninsula, and Mount Sinai is in the south of the Sinai Peninsula. Well, the Sinai Peninsula was called that like in the Middle Ages because that's where they believed Sinai was.
Right.
So that's after the fact. So it was actually, I think it was part of Egypt actually at that time, or disputed territory or something. So, but they called Egyptians called what we now call the Sinai Peninsula, they called it Ta Mefkat. And that was the land of turquoise. That's where they did the turquoise mines. Well, anyway, that's the traditional view. And then there's the more new view, which is the Bitter Lakes region or something like that, where it's really more of like a tidal wave where the waters can go back and they're shallow ponds, so to speak. But honestly, I still think that could be miraculous because the fact that the whole army is, drowned in this 5 foot of water, it's still, if it's a tidal wave, it's still going to kill them all. So I actually don't have anything against it. I actually considered that for a period of time. But then there's the Gulf of Aqaba argument, and that is the Gulf. And what that means is the Exodus crossing actually goes across the northern part, and there is actually what they call, it was a trade route,
caravan trail,
and the ancient people took. Yeah, caravan route, and went down into Etham and all that. Well, he makes these fascinating arguments about these various 5, locations that Moses references, and they're not. His argument is that they're not cities. So what he says is, I don't know if I've got them all. Etham is more of an area; it's not a city, and it's that area right in the northern part of Gulf of Aqaba. And there is a turning. The turning back is that Hebrew word can mean turn away or turn. It doesn't have to mean go 180 degrees or anything like that. Mm-hmm. It just could be you're going off the track, right? So they would have to go south then in order to go down to the Gulf of Aqaba. And then there's the Gulf of Aqaba has these huge mountains that there's only one beach along the whole
right,
coast of Aqaba, mm-hmm. and it's the beach of Nuweiba, right? And so they've done all this fascinating information about it, but so some of these names just were fascinating to me because Pihahirot is he goes into the Hebrew of it. Glenn Fritz does, and he argues how it basically can mean like the mouth of the canal or the mouth of the cave or something. It could mean one of those. We know that language is fluid when it comes to names, but the Pihahirot is according to him, it's the beginning of the long traverse of the what do you call it? Not caverns.
Canyons?
Canyons, that's it. Thank you. There's a long canyon route, and if you stand there, it's like you're at the mouth of the cave or the mouth of the canyon, right? And so he says that's what he was saying, because there's no city, so Moses is just describing, what he sees, and he's giving it names. And so when they're at the sea, and he says their backs are to Migdal. Well, Migdal means tower, and the mountains there were towering mountains. Yeah, so he's calling those, that's the tower mountains. But the cool thing about Baal Zephon is, that you and I know that's a reference to the mountain of Baal, which mm-hmm. is way up there in Syria, right?
It's like 600 miles away.
Yes. But interestingly, that's north. And it is north of that opening of what, Fritz argues is Pihahirot. And that's a direction reference. In fact, he gives some examples of how in the ancient world, Egyptians would use Baal Zephon as a compass directional point. It's towards Baal Zephon. So in other words, you're facing Baal Zephon, which is the north. And that's sort of, these terms are not cities. They're actually terms expressing the locations of where they are and where they're located, that kind of thing. So those are some interesting little tidbits here and there. But one of the most fascinating things I learned, and I'm pretty convinced of this, and that is that the Red Sea is not the Red Sea. What I mean by that is the Hebrew word is Yam Suf, mm-hmm. and scholars have argued about this, but it doesn't translate as Red Sea. Actually, it would be a different word. It actually, and this is why people say it actually means Sea of Reeds. Yam means sea. What does Suf mean? And there's these arguments that it's based on Egyptian Tufi and all this, but that's an etymological argument. But there's major problems with that because if you argue that Yam Suf is Sea of Reeds, there's no reeds in saltwater, right? So there's major problems that arise with that. But here's the interesting thing. So Fritz goes through every example where Yam Suf is in the Bible, and he points out that there are two or three of the cases, I think it's 2 cases where it's very clearly referring to the Gulf of Aqaba, because they'll actually translate it. They won't translate it as Red Sea because it's not the same as what they're translating, right? And everyone knows that's where Midian is, and that's so Yam Suf is very clearly the Gulf of Aqaba. And then in every other case, it could be questioned, right? But here's the thing. So he points out how the word Suf, it actually refers to is the ending, like the ending of the riverbank, or the ending, like in the sea, there's a passage, I can't remember, it's in Jonah. He goes down to the bottom and that word suf is there, but there's no reeds in the sea, right?
Sure,
so
yeah.
it's talking about the end or the base of the sea. So the word suf is actually, and by the way, this isn't just Glenn Fritz. He refers to actual biblical scholars who are making the argument that Yam Suf means the sea of the end or the sea of endings. And that means it's the Gulf of Aqaba, and it's not the Red Sea. Now, here's the thing. Why did the translators translate it that way? Right? Because the Septuagint translators, right? And they were Greek Jews and ancient, right? He goes through and he shows how the Greeks were like the cartographers and stuff of the time, and he shows how many of the maps do not include the Gulf of Aqaba.
Right. They didn't know it was there. Yeah.
They didn't know it was there. So when they go to translate the word Yam Suf, and all they know is just, well, this is the only sea. They're going to have to, it's got to mean Red Sea, even though it's not the words Red Sea, right? So that's all these little elements all pulled together to sort of argue that it's still a miraculous crossing because Gulf of Aqaba, it's very deep and God has to pull back the waters and such. But so the point is it's still miraculous and there's no, you're not saying it's not the Red Sea. Oh, no, it's just that the word Yam Suf doesn't mean. There's always problems with translation, and this is one of them that I was not aware of, and it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
So I follow his argument for the Gulf of Aqaba being that crossing, because then Midian is across there, and then that's where the Mount Sinai is, which is another debated issue, but it blows the information that Glenn Fritz gives, the geographical information for each part of the journey of the Sinai. Of the wilderness until they get to Mount Sinai, it's phenomenal because it all makes sense in light of the stories that are being told in Exodus and Numbers as they arrive in Mount Sinai, and so it's really fascinating. So I think, and many people have heard of this argument already. I think what is it, Jabal al-Musa or something? I think there's two mounts that are possibilities, and I think he argues mostly for Jabal al-Musa, but that area is what he argues is Sinai. So that's the sort of the approach I followed. But if you're reading the novel, you're not gonna get this academic type stuff. That's all the background, so that when I told the story, it would flow as realistically as I could write it. Does that make sense?
It does. That's one of the things that I'm learning from Sharon, who also does historical fiction, and she spends hours on hours just looking at maps of Victorian London so that she gets the layout of the streets correct. I'm running into some of this now where I'm looking at, where I've got some action set in St. Louis, and I better look at Google Earth to see where exactly that all lays out. People don't realize even when you're writing fiction, but especially if you're writing a historical fiction, there's a lot of research that goes into it. You have to read a lot. You've got to know a lot more about the world you're describing than what you actually include in the novel. And I know this conversation is only scratching the surface of the information that's in the novel. But one thing I found interesting, and I want to just maybe bring this to a final question, because I found it really intriguing. I thought Sharon and I might be kind of out there and holding this opinion. But in your companion book, The Spiritual World of Moses in Egypt, you bring Leviathan in, and Leviathan, of course, is a character that appears in a number of your other novels. You mentioned Leviathan earlier, the multi-headed chaos dragon that appears in Psalm 74, Isaiah 27, verse 1. And you connect Leviathan not only to the Red Sea crossing, but also to the beast that comes out of the sea in the book of Revelation, which is fascinating because, again, that's not something that most who study the book of Revelation make that connection. I found it fascinating. What role does Leviathan play, and why did you bring Leviathan in, and specifically in this story? Because that's the first time I've heard of it and thought of connecting this to the Red Sea crossing.
Yeah, well, I brought it in. I brought Leviathan in. Readers of my series will know that Leviathan is one of my major bad guy characters. He's in every novel, but it's because it's just so interesting, right? But I didn't force him in. We read that passage in Psalm 74. I'd always known that he describes Leviathan there at the Red Sea crossing, and his head's being crushed. And it's like, that's cool. I want to see what that looks like, and I want to tell that story. So it was based on the text itself, but also, the Egyptians had their own sea serpent of chaos, which was called Apophis. And Apophis was the sort of the chaos that Ra battled on his solar boat as he went through the underworld, because if he's the sun rising, right, he's going through the world at night. It's night, it's the sea. He's battling Apophis, the sea serpent, and he vanquishes him so that he can rise in the next day, right? So that's that's the same motif in Egypt as everywhere else. The dragon and the sea and the sea dragon. It's sort of like they're united symbols or images of chaos, and you could say evil, right? And so, I do think that the writers of the New Testament, they're Jews, they're steeped in all that stuff. I think they're deliberately bringing that Leviathan imagery. Now, John's reshaping it, reforming it for his own purposes, because I'm pretty sure most every viewpoint of Revelation would agree that that's symbolic, right? I mean,
sure.
There are some people that maybe think it is a literal dragon or something. Beast coming out of the sea.
Yeah, perhaps, but I've
heard one or two kooks.
Yeah.
No, but so anyway, my point is that so we all agree that that's symbolic, and so I think he's drawing, and it's satanic. Obviously, there's a satanic connection, but John is drawing from that long heritage and tradition of this chaos monster, because I think that this is also throughout the whole novel. Chaos and order is an ancient primal theme in all of ancient literature, but I think it's modern too, to be honest. But it's just we have different ways of addressing it, right? But the chaos versus order, I find it so fascinating, and that is one of my dominant themes in the whole novel. And so that's why Leviathan does come into play. And I point out how, because Janus and Jambres are actually Jews who became magicians for Pharaoh, they have both the Jewish background and the Egyptian background, so they make the connection between Apophis in Egypt and Leviathan in Canaan, right? That they know about, so there's a part of the journey where they're going up to get some lumber, from the Lebanon, right? Because Egypt drew a lot of lumber and stuff for their building and stuff. And so that's where I bring in a little bit about the gods of Canaan, which you'll see in the next novel. So if you read Moses, there's actually the sequel novels are already written.
Oh, okay.
Joshua Valiant and Caleb Vigilant.
Gotcha. So
my Moses novel, because I wrote those before, and now it's all one unified whole. So Moses novel ends with them after Sinai. They're on, there's a little bit of time. They start to build the tabernacle, and I have the golden calf incident. And then they start to set off for Kadesh Barnea. Then the Joshua novel starts with they're already been in Kadesh Barnea, and the spies are spying out the land, and they come back and they say there's giants. So then it's about the conquering of the Transjordan and then going over into Canaan. So now it's a unified sort of whole. I may someday do a box set of all three in one, but it does fit together. Oh, my point was, so I actually do have some foreshadowing of the Canaanite deities. Why? Because here's an interesting thing. So in this paradigm of the new chronology and David Rohl, the Hyksos invade after Egypt is devastated by the plagues, which, there's a famous ancient document called the Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage, or the Admonitions of Ipuwer.
Right.
And it's one of the ancient documents that describes the plagues. Now, it's not exactly one for one like we would understand it, but he has the river turning to blood. He has all the crops dying, the children dying, all this stuff. There's a lot of them that's in there from the Egyptian perspective, what it might look like. And David Rohl does actually argue that it's contested in terms of exactly when it was, but he makes good argument for it being right around the time of 1440 BC type of thing. So that's an interesting connection there. But So we're going to meet these Canaanite gods, but if the Hyksos, which are the shepherd kings, which are Amalekites and Midianites and other, southern tribes of that area that invade, the shepherd kings as they call them, or the Shasu, right? They've got Canaanite deities in their background, and so then what I have is when Moses is on their way to Sinai, they come to Rephidim. That's when they battle the Amalekites, and when he raises the staff, the Jews, Hebrews win, and when they look right. Well, the Amalekites are a diabolical tribe, and they have some connection to giants because the battle of the giant kings in Genesis 14. They're at least Amalekites. The land of the Amalekites is connected with all these known giant tribes, so I think there's some connection there. But here's an interesting thing too. Within this paradigm, David Rohl, his chronology ends up having Akhenaten and the Amarna letters, which are a very famous collection of letters. That's around the time of 1000 BC now. Different chronologies placed in different, I understand that, but he understands that to take place around 1000 BC. So he actually also describes how there are mentions in the Amarna letters of Saul and David. Saul is called Labayu, the Lion Man, Lion King, and David is Dadua. That sounds close. But so my point about this is that he also points out that there's a scarab found in Jericho with Sheshai's name on it, and it's Egyptian. And Sheshai is one of the three famous sons of Arba giants who are mentioned multiple times in the book of Joshua. So much so that I made them characters in my Joshua novel, right? So Sheshai is one of these leading giants, a giant ruler type of thing. Well, he makes the, of course, David Rohl doesn't believe in the giants. He's not a Christian, but he believes in the historicity. So he argues that Sheshai, and he knows Sheshai is mentioned in the Bible. He argues that Sheshai was part of those tribes that then invaded, and he set up rule there. But he came back because, think about it, it was 40 years before the Hebrews ever went into the Promised Land anyway. So, and the Hyksos didn't stay there very long. Well, how many years, right, before they were kicked out? So, so he argues that Sheshai was part of that, maybe marauding party or whatever. And the original Hyksos are more brutal and, relatively speaking, primitive than the later Hyksos, And so he makes that historical connection with that real scarab and stuff. So I bring Sheshai into this Moses story with the Amalekite battle, and this sort of foreshadows. This is the first time that they come across some of these giants in the battle. There's only a few of them because they're Anakim who are with the Amalekites, and so that's a fascinating connection where I'm trying to make the historical sense of history play out within my story of the spiritual reality as well. And so you get a little bit of of my characters that are to come in the next novel, Joshua Valiant, show up in Moses at the end there, and it sort of ties it together kind of nicely.
Fascinating.
And brings in some of the giants.
And I was looking for something that was tickling in the back of my brain as you were talking about the connection between the Amalekites and the Hyksos. And Immanuel Velikovsky mentioned, I think, first proposed this back in 1952, his book Ages in Chaos, and suggested that they were one and the same. But there's some logic behind that because Egypt would have been totally devastated. Economically, their workforce had just disappeared with the Israelites. Their military was destroyed. And suddenly, if you're one of the neighbors of Egypt, especially if you're just a little bit tired of being ruled by those pharaohs down south, hey, boys, now's the time. Let's go get them. And so there is some logic behind that. Not all scholars will agree that that is the correct interpretation of the evidence on the ground, but
in fact, I'll gladly admit that this new chronology view is clearly a minority view, but I'm no stranger to minority views. Yeah. After all, I'm a reformed preterist, right? So, but yeah, I'm used to these minority views. But yeah, so But you're right. That by the way, that's one of the strengths of the arguments is that there's no really other time. The Hyksos could not invade and take over during a powerful time of period like the time of Ramses. You know what I mean? Like, and that's a whole nother issue too. Like, did Pharaoh die in the sea? And I know there's debates on that.
Yep.
The honest to God's truth is there's a few verses that reference it, but they are ambiguous, and so but they could be either way. Is the bottom line here, and of course we have Ramses' body, and I actually do think that he died in the sea. Even though the ambiguity, I still think it leans more towards the Pharaoh dying, the verse that talks about that. But regardless of that, pharaohs always led their chariots and into battle, and there's no way Pharaoh would have let his guys. He was so pissed off at the Israelites. He wanted to get Moses. Like, it's more, to me, it fits the pattern of the Egyptian understanding that he would lead the charioteers. So he would have died in the sea. Again, it could be either way, but it's interesting as you explore the possibilities,
As a Christian author, I would presume anyway that there's an overarching message to the story and the telling of Moses' tale. What do you hope people take away, if there is a central message here? What do you hope people take away from reading the new novel?
Well, I do try to write complex themes where it's not just one thing, it's multiple things. I've already mentioned a couple of them. One that was important to me personally, and that's probably my personal approach, is the fatherhood, understanding God through fatherhood. But there was something that kind of came out of it, and you know how, like, when you write, you do plot out some things, you outline, and you do have very consciously ideas of what you're going to write, but there's also a lot that you discover. I discover about, 30 to 40% of my story as I'm writing it. And when you're doing the study, you really do, if you're really honest about it, there's a lot of brutality in Exodus. And from God. I mean, it's not without reason why atheists, would point to the God of Sinai, say, what kind of a loving God is that? Destroying these people with plagues, and then destroying his own people with plagues and striking them down dead, and everything that he gets angry, wants to wipe them all out. It's like you do get this sense of like, wow, God is being very brutal, right? Mm-hmm. Now, first of all, I think that this is the Bronze Age is a very brutal time period, and God is operating within it. So I don't have a problem myself with the fact that you got to work this way in this kind of world. However, what struck me was in the midst, it's like it comes a point where we're near the end, they're worshiping the golden calf, and you're just like, they're worshiping the golden calf after all that? Like, they all deserve to die, Mm-hmm. I mean, if you really have any sense of fairness, it's the old adage of where people say, if God's so loving, why does he kill all these people or whatever? And it's like, no, it's the opposite. If God is so just, why doesn't he kill everybody?
Yeah.
Because everybody deserves it so badly. So for my mindset, then, he does all this destruction. He sends a plague on the Jews on the Hebrews for the calf and all this. And but he does punish Aaron for leading it, and he makes him the high priest. And there's no punishment for him.
Yeah.
Miriam at best gets the leprosy, but then she gets cured. But my point is, like, these two rebels, and they don't get, and it suddenly struck me. It's like, from a godless mindset, you say, well, that isn't fair. See, look at what he does. He condemns all these other people and their children and kills them, and then other people who are bad, he doesn't do. That's grace. The irony of it all is that's the power of the glory of God's grace, where actually he should have wiped them all out because they're so full of wickedness, mm-hmm. but he withholds his judgment, and he chooses some who are still corrupt, but he's going to use them for his purposes because of his grace and his love to bring his people out of that sin, but it's within this cauldron of violence and brutality. But that's how you get the glimpse of God's glory and God's mercy and grace course, the godless doesn't see that because their mindset is on accusing God, but it's like, that's what hit me. Because I was trying to make sense of this. Why didn't God do anything to Aaron? I mean, he strikes all these people dead with a plague, but he makes Aaron high priest, Well, that's what it is. God had his purposes for Aaron as high priest. And even though Aaron was a sinful man, God had grace on him because he wanted to accomplish his purposes in that sense. In the same way that he had grace on Moses, obviously, but those are some of the themes.
The whole idea of fatherhood and understanding God through the role of fatherhood is, I think, apt, because we can ask those questions too. Why did God do this to these people? But we don't see the whole picture. We don't understand all of the consequences of the things that we do, just as our 3-year-old child does not understand the consequence of running out into the road after the ball. And if they won't listen after the first time, then you have to make it very, very clear, perhaps with the paddle or the bat, whatever, perhaps to get their attention in order to save them from a greater consequence, a more harmful consequence down the road that they don't see because they just don't have the wisdom of us as fathers or as parents. In the same way, God is viewing a much bigger scope. He's got a much wider scope, a bigger vision for what's actually going on than we do. And so,
amen.
By our standards, if we could apprehend the mind of God completely, he would be a pretty small God. The new novel is Moses Against the Gods of Egypt, Chronicles of the Watchers, Book 3. And I recommend the companion volume if you're interested in the research, the biblical research, the archaeological textual research behind the novel, The Spiritual World of Moses in Egypt. Brian has done a number of books like this. The book on Psalm 82 is extremely helpful to understanding what is going on in this. God Against the Gods is Godawa.com. Go there. I'll put links for the specific novels in the show notes at Amazon, where you can get the hard copy. And because he's smart like us and does Kindle Unlimited, if you've got the Kindle Unlimited plan with Amazon, you can read the novel for free, which you can also do with mine, by the way. So, Brian, thanks very much for taking time out.
No problem.
And looking forward to reading more of these. Again, getting stories that have great action. You're a very visual writer, which I guess comes from your experience writing screenplays. But to do this with the spiritual aspect and to tell the story of these warring factions behind the scenes as they try to overthrow the throne of God, man, I mean, when you got the Bible as source material, what more do you need?
Amen. Thanks for having me on, man.
Coming up, we'll tell you how to save $20 off the registration for a conference coming to Dallas as A View from the Bunker continues. Question: how do you fight something you cannot see? Davian is a third-level master of the Order, a small group of men who alone have the power to battle the most fearsome creatures in all of Saramond. For thousands of years, the Brothers of the Order have protected their world. Now, something has upset the delicate balance of power between man and dragon, and Davian must face what appears to be a dragon that cannot be seen. But Davian is losing his grip on reality, and the fate of the world rests with a stable hand, an underfed priest, and a gardener who's fallen from the stars. Iron Dragons, Book 1 of the Saramond Quest by Derek P. Gilbert. New from Rose Avenue Fiction. Driving the internet to think. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. You'll find us online at VFTB.net. We've also got various other sites around the web where you can find us on social media, Twitter at View from Bunker or at Derek Gilbert. Facebook, View from the Bunker is the page. Give us a like there. You'll also find me on Gab, MeWe, Getter, Parler, Derek P. Gilbert. The username there, Derek P. Gilbert. And, of course, links to subscribe to all of the various podcast sites posted in the right-hand column at VFTB.net, which is our global hub for this media operation. Just very quickly, it can be frustrating for us I guess especially men, because we want to have everything, quantified, numbered, cataloged, and fit neatly into a spreadsheet or a chart or a graph. The fact that scholars argue about the dates specifically, who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, who was the Pharaoh under under whom Joseph served, and really intelligent scholars who have done a lot more research into this than I have come to very different answers. I mean, if you go back and listen to the Doug Petrovich interview, you'll see he's got some different thoughts on the Pharaoh of the Exodus than you'll find in the new novel by Brian Godawa. But when you step back, and I'll just say this. We've got an interview coming for the Bible's Greatest Mysteries, probably April timeframe. We're working that far ahead. Dr. Craig Olson, who argues that we've got to have a 215-year sojourn in Egypt instead of a 430-year sojourn, because if you push Abraham that far back, he's visiting cities that didn't exist at the time, 21st century BC. Anyway, lots of people studying this very hard to try to come up with the answers. But the bottom line is this: when you look at the flow of the history recorded in the Bible, and then compare it with the evidence that you find in the ground, the sequence of events matches. The Bible was not intended to be written as a history book as we in the 21st century understand history. It was intended to explain certain very important theological concepts. This is why we are here. This is why the world is in such a state. And here is what Hashem, Yahweh, God, is going to do to fix it all. That's what the Bible is about. And when we look at it in that sense, we see that, hey, we don't have our trust is not based on blind faith. The evidence is there. And highly recommend Brian's novels as a way to perhaps draw in some young adult readers. I would say 13, 14 and above. And it's a way to help them see, kids, that we're in the middle of an epic struggle. Lord of the Rings on steroids, and that get excited about being part of something that's bigger than they are, and I think that's a really cool thing. A couple of conferences to tell you about. One of them is just around the corner. Sharon and I are going to be working on our presentations over the holidays because it's a virtual conference that launches New Year's Day. It's from our friends Mike Kerr and Jeannie Moore at Hear the Watchman, the Remnant Revolution 2022. Remnant Revolution 2022, a virtual conference, and this includes both of us, our good friends, Dr. Michael Lake, Jamie Walden, Josh Peck, Tom Dunn, Michael Boldea, Pastor Paul Begley, Dr. Mike Spalding, Coach Dave Daubenmeier, and more. 6 months, unlimited access, and access codes will be sent out to get access to all of the video presentations on December 31st. So on New Year's Eve, begin watching on New Year's Day. You'll have 6 months to watch all of these presentations. For more information, hearthewatchmen.com, hearthewatchmen.com. The beginning of March, Sharon and I will be at the His Call Ministries. His Call Ministries. You had to think for a second as I'm trying to bring up the notes on the fly here. We will be there for a weekend retreat at the Finley River Ranch. His Call Ministries is a wonderful group. Joyce Stevenson is coordinating the events, but this is the ministry of Alec and Ginny Wade, and we will be there the first weekend in March. We're calling this weekend retreat The Return of Saturn and the Great Reset, March 4th through March 6th. The Finley River Ranch is in Sparta, Missouri. Sparta is about halfway between Springfield and Branson. So if you're in southwest Missouri, northwest Arkansas, or if you just like to travel, drive a little bit, it's a wonderful weekend, and they've got some land there. Might be a little chilly for camping out, but if you've got that capability, that might work for you. You can find more information at my website, derekpgilbert.com, or go to hiscallministries.net, hiscallministries.com. Hiscallministries.com. Again, March 4th through 6th, the weekend retreat, The Return of Saturn and The Great Reset. And then a little later in March, the 17th through the 20th, Sharon and I will be in Dallas, Grapevine, Texas, the Hilton DFW Lakes Conference Center for the Eyes to See Conference from Hear the Watchman. This will be our return to Dallas 2 years after we essentially shut down the state when COVID closed everything down in March of 2020. So we'll be there again. A wonderful facility. The staff has been there. The same folks working there every time we've been back. And I think this will be fifth time, if I'm remembering correctly. Anyway, some great speakers lined up. Pastor Paul Begley, Jamie Walden, Michael Bodea, Dave Hodges, host of the Common Sense Show, Dr. Michael Lake, and of course, Sharon and me. We will be there as well. And if you use the promo code Gilbert20, Gilbert20, you will save $20 off on the registration. And also, there's an early bird discount that applies through the end of the month. More information online at hearthewatchmen.com, hearthewatchmen.com. And once again, if you're going to sign up, please remember that promo code Gilbert20, which knocks $20 off the cost. Skywatch TV's tour of Israel. We haven't made an official announcement yet, but with the things that are happening around the world regarding travel with the Omicron variant, it's looking doubtful. Israel has put the United States on its red list, meaning no travelers from the U.S. to Israel. When that will change, we don't know, but with the uncertainty, we'll be in communication with Aaron Lipkin at Lipkin Tours over the holidays and making an announcement after the first of the year officially as to what's going to happen with the Skywatch TV tour of Israel. So pray that you had a blessed Christmas and that you're enjoying this time of rest, relaxation, some time with family and friends through the holidays, and look forward to a blessed, safe, healthy 2022. We appreciate you taking time to listen. And if you get a spare moment or two, if you would, leave a review at Spreaker, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Spotify, wherever you find us, which of course is wherever fine podcasts are sold. You'll also see us on YouTube, youtube.com/Derek Gilbert, and you can give us a like at Facebook as well, the Facebook page for View from the Bunker. Our announcer is DC Good, and A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House, released under Creative Commons Attribution, no commercials, or non-commercial, no derivatives, 4.0 international license. One of these days I'll get that right. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.